Okay, the video is just live. We are live. We are live.
Hi, welcome to yet another tour of sacred spaces. We are here today at the Gregory Baha'i Museum, the only one, as I was told, in the world, a Baha'i museum. I'm with Al and Dee. They're going to take us around, and guess who is at the who's taking the video? That's Dana. We are from Charleston Interreligious Council, and Dana is the president, and I'm just the walker taking her around.
Our board member.
Yes, welcome here, and I'll give it to Al and Dee to tell us about the faith and about the museum.
Yes, welcome and thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to personally thank Charleston Local Spiritual Assembly for Baha'is, and also Dee is a representative from the Assembly. And this is a sacred space for us, and it's a unique space. This is the childhood home of a young man who grew up in Charleston. As a ordinary citizen, had aspirations for doing things that would make the world nicer and a more united place, and got that opportunity and did extremely well with the opportunity once it was presented to him. Louis G. Gregory. This is his childhood home. This particular property was acquired by the Local Spiritual Assembly of Baha'is in around 1983, and then 1989. The Assembly worked on ways to improve the space, and the space was renovated. We had one of our own Baha'i architects, who happens to be Anita Brown, worked for the U.S. Park Service and actually did the architectural work, and she's a Clemson grad. And also, this particular property was dedicated in 2003 because the project was completed. And here you have the sacred space, the Louis G. Gregory Baha'i Museum. Let's go inside. And this museum is unique in that in Charleston, most people are aware of the museums having grand spaces and they're celebrating artifacts. This museum is unique in that it celebrates the divine spirit of an individual who's just like all of us, who embraced the cause and did wonderful things that affected the whole world. Louis G. Gregory, race amity, and the oneness of mankind. Let's walk inside.
So we'd like to welcome you to the Louis G. Gregory Baha'i Museum. And as is the Baha'i custom, we typically start any gathering with prayers. So we would like to open with a Baha'i prayer for unity, specifically important today. O my God, verily I invoke thee and supplicate before thy threshold, asking thee that all thy mercies may descend upon these souls. Specialize them for thy favor and thy truth. O Lord, unite and bind together the hearts, join in accord all the souls, and exhilarate the spirits through the signs of thy sanctity and oneness. O Lord, make these faces radiant through the light of thy oneness. Strengthen the loins of thy servants in the service of thy kingdom. O Lord, thou possessor of infinite mercy, O Lord of forgiveness and pardon, forgive our sins, pardon our shortcomings, and cause us to turn to the kingdom of thy clemency, invoking the kingdom of might and power, humble at thy shrine, and submissive before the glory of thine evidences. O Lord God, make us waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united, agreed through the bounties of thy love. O Lord, Dilate the breast through the signs of thy oneness, and make all mankind as stars, shining from the same height of glory, as perfect fruits growing upon thy tree of life. Verily, thou art the Almighty, the self-subsistent, the giver, the forgiving, the pardoner, the omniscient, the one creator. Abdul Bahad.
Thank you very much. You know, one thing I realized, I haven't heard a live prayer for a long time.
Right.
Really?
Yes.
It's so nice to hear.
It's beautiful.
In transitioning, we're inside the museum, as I stated. It's totally different from all the other museums that are in Charleston. This museum actually attempts to put a collection of the artifacts that depicts the periods and the life and the transition and the evolution of the life of Louis G. Gregory. And the way we usually start this tour, we usually start on the end, in this section, in this corner, that kind of depicts his formative years. And what we have displayed are his diplomas and his degree from college. Louis G. Gregory was the son of Mary Elizabeth and Ebenezer George, who were slaves on the Dargan Plantation in Darlington, South Carolina. Louis G. Gregory's mom was freed as a slave at 14. She married Ebenezer George and had sons, Louis and Theodore. Louis's father died very early in his life, and upon his death, his mom remarried, and she remarried George Gregory. Mr. Gregory was such a loving father until Louis asked, "Can I take your name?" And he accepted, and he said yes. And so Louis went to his mom and his grandmother, who was Maria Butchcott, and said, "Can I take his name?" She said yes. And from that day on, he was Louis George Gregory. And what Mr. Gregory did, Mr. Gregory was a free man. George Gregory, his stepfather, he loved Louis, but he wanted to make sure that Louis had an education, that he had aspirations, and that he realized those aspirations. So when the Avery School opened, Louis and himself went to Avery, graduated, was an outstanding student, actually gave part of the commencement address. In 1891, he graduated from Avery. You know where this house is on this Borders Court, it's less than about 0.6 miles, so Louis would walk and through the city of Charleston to his school. And Louis had a fond likeness for this community. You know how Charleston is. Everybody's friendly, and he reflected on that. He said all of his friends, this is one thing about the South and about Charleston. People have always been nice. Doesn't matter what the race, but then there are also people that had issues. But he saw the goodness. When he graduated from Avery in 1891, he quickly matriculated to Fisk University, where he received his degree. His father paid for his first year, his stepfather paid for his first year, and Louis worked in that substance, financial assistance, and graduated in 1896. As soon as he graduated from Avery, he came back, and it was a faculty at Avery. When he graduated from Fisk, he came back and became a member of the faculty. That endeared Louis to a lot of the Charlestonians, but Louis had another aspiration. Louis wanted to be a lawyer. That was his aspiration. And because in the South, they did not have schools for African Americans, he had to go to Washington, D.C. This aspiration took him away from the South for a long time. And so he went to Howard University, got his law degree in 1902. As soon as he got his law degree in Washington at Howard in 1902, he started a law practice in Washington, D.C. Louis G. Gregory has always been on the cutting edge. He was one of these people that saw things that needed to be done and made them happen. He talked to everybody. He shared his hope for the future. And right here are some of the pictures of him at different ages. This is when he was older, and then this is when he was a younger gentleman. His grandmother and stepfather taught him tailoring, and he did work as a tailor and when he was in college. So you can see the fashions there. Somebody at council, Louis Gregory, when you see him walking, they say he looks like a dancer. He's so erect and straight and so prominent. When you turn to this particular artifact, this artifact speaks to the number of letters that Mr. Gregory would write to his friends, and every conversation he had spoke about doing things to make the world a better place. He was really concerned about his people who had just come out of slavery, because he was born in 1874, and he wanted to give them a society or a way to matriculate. So that was his calling. His life changed once he graduated from Howard. He took a job in 1906 at the Supreme Court, working as a lawyer, an accountant, all the other things that needed to happen. But he met two interesting people. A Southern gentleman who happened to be from this area, from the Charleston area, and then another gentleman he met was from the North. They would have these heated discussions about the Confederacy and this and that, and Mr. Gregory would just laugh because they both would get so excited. He would every now and then poke fun to get the argument more heated. Both of these gentlemen had gone to Baha'i meetings, and they kept saying to Lewis, "You need to go to this meeting. We think you like what they're saying." The one who persisted was a Southern gentleman. He told Mr. Gregory, "You need to go to this meeting." Now, enter the Baha'i faith. Mr. Gregory started to go to these meetings. I'm going to divert a little bit and talk briefly about, which can take up a whole conversation, Abdul Bahad. Abdul Bahad is the eldest son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. He is the head of the Baha'i faith from 1892 to 1921. Abdul Bahad was worldly known. He was incarcerated with his father for most of his life. But when the Turkish Revolution happened and he was released from prison, he and his father and the other adherents of the Baha'i faith, he petitioned and wanted to come to America because the Baha'is in America, which was a small community, wanted him to come to America. He comes to America in 1912. Abdul Bahad is the individual that Mr. Gregory attributes to his confirmations. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Abdul Bahad is the head of the faith. We refer to him as the master. He is the perfect exemplar of the Baha'i writings in action. With that said, I'll move to this artifact, which talks about the literary society, the Bethel Literary Society that Mr. Gregory was at one time the president of. When Mr. Gregory began to and I share this history to lead up to the fact that Mr. Gregory, prior to becoming a Baha'i, was very involved in the community. Everybody knew him. He was a great speaker. He was a lecturer. He was an intellectual. I mean, the whole community embraced him. When Mr. Gregory started learning about the faith, he was in this process with W. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver. They were all trying to come up with this concept of a new society for the slaves to matriculate. But during that same time, when Mr. Gregory finally appeased his southern friend who told him he needed to go to this Baha'i meeting, a cold night in 1907, he went to the meeting and he met this white southern woman whose name happened to be Pauline Ann and her husband. On that night, Mr. Gregory heard something that changed his life. He said that the things that they told him for a year kept him spellbound. He didn't know. He said he was like he's dumbfounded. He sat there and he listened. And he said he quickly realized that all of the things he was doing, they were already answered in his faith. So in 1909, he wrote himself I am a confirmed believer in the cause of Baha'u'llah. As soon as he became a Baha'i, he writes, which was the custom in that time, to Abdul Bahad. Abdul Bahad was in Ramallah, Egypt, spending some time recuperating, and Abdul Bahad told him that he needed to wait a while to come to pilgrimage. Eventually, he was granted permission to come to pilgrimage. When Louis Gregory came to pilgrimage, Abdul Bahad introduced them to this lady, who is an English woman, that he was playing matchmaker, Abdul Bahad. And white English woman. You want to talk a little bit about that? You talk a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know all of the details, but I do know that that I believe I heard the story that Abdul Bahad, in his role of matchmaker, saw in Mr. Gregory the possibilities of modeling what race amity could look like. And these two folks fell in love and did end up marrying. And it made it very challenging because at the time, interracial marriage was illegal in many places, specifically in this country. And so after they married, I believe I've heard the stories that Mr. Gregory continued to travel around speaking about the Baha'i faith, but he was not able to take his wife with him because there were so many spaces that they were not allowed to be in as a married couple in this country. So he was a trailblazer through and through.
Yes. And keep in mind, the other thing is that Abdul Bahad was a matchmaker because when he came to America, he brought Louisa in tow with him on the Cedric. When he was doing the maiden voyage of the Titanic. And the Baha'is wanted him to come on the Titanic, but he chose the Cedric, and he came over on the Cedric with Louisa.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they got married, and so you see Mr. Gregory here. Once Mr. Gregory became a Baha'i, and this picture is very interesting to me because it depicts for me his life's passion. You remember I told you he started a law firm? He stopped. He said, he called himself a race amity worker.
I had a question. Yes. What that language is? Was it Egyptian or Arabic?
It's Arabic.
Arabic.
Yes, yeah, It means, it's the greatest name. It means God is most glorious.
This is how Baha'u'llah's name is depicted.
Yeah.
So in most Baha'i spaces and homes, you will find a version of the greatest name.
Yeah, the greatest name. Yes. And as we move on, the other artifacts, the pupil of the eye, this is a term that Baha'u'llah used in reference to the black people in the Baha'i faith and the black people in general. He said that we, about dark skin, each person has a different color eyes, but the pupil is dark. And he said that the pupil has the ability to draw the light and to perceive what's in front of it. And that's our legacy as a race of people, that we have that ability to know the spiritual and then track the light. And that book was written, and we have lots of discussions about that, because in the Baha'i writings, there's no one interpretation that's exactly right. It depends on your level of spirituality as to what you glean from something, because you can read something 2 days later, and if you're more spiritually in tune, you go, oh my God, I didn't know that's because that's what it means, because you got the Word of God, and we don't have the capacity to grasp the whole concept, because we aren't God. And so when we at different spiritual levels, we get different things from the same passage we might have read 2 or 3 days ago. But this is a portrait of Mr. Gregory, which is taken from his biography done by Gail Morrison. The reason why we have this here, this is done by a local artist and actually sells her wares down at the market. Nina Uccello, a Baha'i, she did that depiction, and we put that as a labor of love from Nina, and it's a beautiful photograph. Speaking of Mr. Gregory, every conversation, every letter he had, everything he talked about was Baha'u'llah and the wonders of mankind. The pivotal teaching of the Baha'i faith is that humanity being separate is not God's intention. Humanity must unite. And each of our responsibilities to change ourselves, because in each of us, we have God in us. Through our associations, we create these veils that hide that light. And what we have to do is to turn inward, cleanse ourselves, and the light is there. You hear people always talk about God moving. The question is, who moved? Where's God? Who moved? You moved. Because Baha'u'llah says, noble have I created thee. Why dost thou abase thyself? And he's speaking about how we are noble beings, make ourselves less through association with things that aren't of God. And that's what we do. And that's why each of us has such a spiritual legacy. And that's why as Baha'is, we're told to even love our enemies, because they are God's people. And in time, they will do what they need to do if God intends them. But they have to have that conversation. You notice we open with prayer. The reason why we open with prayer is a prayer is something that we're asking God to do for us. As Baha'is, we read writings, because the writings tell us what we need to do for God. And that's the challenge, and that's the legacy that Mr. Gregory did so wonderfully well. When he was on pilgrimage, Abdul Bahad told him, this is your legacy. I want you to be the cause so that the white and the black races would solve their differences. That's what he told him. He took it to heart. When he left, he quit his job, he sold his house, he married his wife, and he went teaching the cause of Baha'u'llah, race amity, the oneness of humanity. And when you look at these artifacts of letters of some of his contemporaries, everything is about the faith and about oneness and about how it changes your life. And about, he's not unique. You can be just like him, but you got to orient to the light. And that's what Baha'is are about. The Baha'i faith and Baha'is are called followers of light. We follow the light. And in this dispensation, this is, Baha'is believe, the day that the kingdom of God will be on earth, as the Our Father prayer said. When I was a kid, every night I would say the Our Father prayer. And when I became a Baha'i, it blew me away. And I'm living at a time that the world can have the kingdom of God on earth, only if we individually change. And we can do it. The question is, how long? And you know God gives us the right to say no to him. Because he says he wants to be able to separate those who love him and those who want to be with him, as opposed to forcing them. I mean, in this creation of us, Baha'u'llah says, in my immemorial being, I knew my love for thee. Therefore, I created thee and made thee in my image. It's a love story. And you notice all of the songs, all of the sonnets, everything talks about love. Because love is the answer. And everybody sings and talks about it. We gotta love. Baha'u'llah says love is a gift from God. Love. If we love, we have race amity. If we have amity, we don't have estrangement. And if you don't think estrangement is a very powerful thing, even people who are in what we call our close family, if you stay away from them long enough, when you see them the next time, you're a little leery about getting close to them. What Baha'u'llah tells us is that this is not the day and the time to sequester ourselves. The world of humanity is our family. Go out and be among them. Embrace them, love them. And the more you do that, that feeling of estrangement goes away. Okay? This is another picture of Abdul Bahad and the Holy Lands that was shared with the Baha'is. Now, I'm going to share with you a story. This is a wonderful story. One of Mr. Gregory's contemporaries was a very wealthy Baha'i in Washington society. Her name was Agnes Parsons. Louis Gregory and Agnes Parsons were contemporaries. Louis Gregory and Agnes Parsons, white woman, black man in the South, white woman in New York, very wealthy, didn't have any problem with any race because she had money. She didn't see any black people, except for when they served them. So this wasn't their issue. she loved Abdul Bahad. Anything he asked her to do, she would do it. And in 1912, I don't know if y'all know the history. One thing about the Baha'i faith, it makes you understand the world history and it makes sense. In 1919, we had the Red Summer. The race riots were going crazy. People were getting killed. Black people get killed. People riding by people's houses, shooting in the houses, killing people. The black and the white races, the military people who came from the war, they were attacking other black military people, and they wouldn't want to give them the rights. It was just horrific. Abdul Bahad called Agnes Parson to Haifa. Told her, I want you to go back to America. We need to have a template for a conference on race amity, which was all the work that Louis Gregory was doing. Remember I told you Louis Gregory said, I am a race amity worker. So his counterpart, he asked a white, erudite, wealthy woman who didn't think this is her issue to do this. As soon as he told her that, she went back to America, and he told her he would give her further instructions. She said she never really heard anything, but people were put in her way, which tells them that he was helping her in a different way. First thing she called the senator from Nebraska, Senator Clapp. Senator Clapp instructed her, what you need to do, if you're going to have this conference, you need to go ahead and pull together a group of women. Don't make the conservatives upset. Don't do anything that's too flamboyant. And she talked to Louis Gregory. Louis, what do you think? Louis Gregory said, all these other conferences they've done on amity, they don't have a spiritual bent to it. This conference has to have a spiritual bent. You got to tell people about the Baha'i faith. You got to tell them what the new message is for this day. And the conference was a glowing success. 19 Washington women ascribed their name to this thing. Agnes Parson pulled off that 100 years from May 21st of this year, the first Race Amity Conference in Washington, D.C. It was held in the First Congregational Church in Washington, D.C. Each session was attended by 2,000 people.
Wow.
And when the conference was over, the President of the United States said, thank God for that conference. Because it did the healing. What Abdul Bahad had told Americans when he was here in 1912, that we needed to get closer to black and the white races. Because if we didn't, there was going to be blood, and it happened.
It still happens.
It happens. And so this is a conference, this is a model, and Agnes Parson, beautiful white woman, wealthy, did her thing in obedience to Abdul Bahad. This book, the Races of Men. This is a book that was written by Louis Gregory. He wrote, he published, he spoke. The Washington Bee, I'll digress this for a second. Louis Gregory, when he became a Baha'i, because he was so erudite in the black community, he was considered one of the talented tens. He was a gem. Nobody wanted him to leave. When he became a Baha'i, they attacked him, the black community and the people that he was running. They said he'd gone crazy. As a matter of fact, the Washington Bee wrote almost a 2-column attack on him. And the way Louis Gregory was, they knew if you say something to him, he's going to give you something back. When he didn't respond, they said he must have religion. If he didn't respond, he never responded to it.
Just let it go.
Never did.
Wow.
This is one of the volumes that Louis Gregory's published in. It's a Baha'i volume. It's called Star of the West. And in March 1927 he published, and then also in another volume he published. Talking about his devotion to race amity. He could not travel with his wife. When they did travel, she traveled in a separate train, he traveled in a separate train. And he had to find places for colored people to wash their hands and face. But this particular plaque we put here because this depicts the extent of the travel that he did. In 1916, Abdul Bahad asked the Baha'is to teach the faith in the South. There are 18 states in the South that he wanted to have visited. Louis Gregory, in less than 2 years, visited all 16 of those states, spoke to almost over 2,000 people. He did not let up. He was relentless. this was his calling, and this was his thing, and he was going to do it. He was going to do it the best of his ability, and he did. He is considered the standard bearer, even today in the Baha'i faith, of race amity, race unity. Louis Gregory, Charleston born, normal black kid, embraced the cause of Baha'u'llah, becomes a spiritual giant. This is a picture, and this is going to blow your mind. Mr. Gregory was a member of the national governing body of the Baha'is of the United States, elected over 7 times, at least over 7 times.
Wow.
Served as the secretary for at least 4 to 5 times. This man is unique. Not only did he do that, these 2 artifacts here, the way the Baha'is have a covenant with God. When Baha'u'llah came, he gave the Baha'is a covenant, and the covenant was this: upon my death, my eldest son, Abdul Bahad, would be the head of the faith. At his death, an appointed guardian, who had to be from the family line, would be the guardian. Shoghi Effendi, Abdul Bahad's grandson, this is his daughter's son, was appointed the guardian. He's a graduate of Oxford, very erudite. He and Louis Gregory, because the Baha'is in the United States are the champions of the Baha'i administrative order. This religion comes not only scripture, it comes with administrative order and a government. So Louis Gregory and Mr. Gregory and Shoghi Effendi, who we call the sign of God on earth, wrote the bylaws that govern the National Spiritual Center of the Baha'is of the United States today. And this is some of the correspondence between them. That's why we have that. Now, Mr. Gregory started to age, and this house right here, let me put this house back in perspective again. Mr. Gregory visited this house with his wife up until 1929, which is when Mr. Gregory, George Gregory died. And they had this funeral, and the Charleston newspaper put in an invitation for people to attend Mr. Gregory's funeral. His stepfather, he was so well loved. There were over 1,200 people attended the funeral, black and white.
Wow.
And he's buried over in Morovia Cemetery over there off King Street. This is a picture of Mr. Gregory. In his later years, and earlier in his life, he taught at the this very liberal and progressive school up in Elliott, Maine, owned by a wealthy Baha'i, Cyril Farmer. And he taught at this summer schools. Baha'i summer schools are schools in the summer where people go to learn things about the faith. They get to deepen on the writings. They get to talk about other religions and other things, just getting their spiritual house in order. And Mr. Gregory would go and speak, and that shows some of the programs that were at that time. In 1951, Mr. Gregory passed. Upon his passing, here's a picture of Shoghi Effendi. This is a picture of the hands of the cause of God. There are like 51 that were appointed. These are special souls that Baha'u'llah, through his grandson and son, appointed because of their special spiritual character and their devotion to the cause. On his death, Shoghi Effendi wrote to the Baha'i world, mourn the loss of dear Louis, mourn the loss of dear Louis Gregory, deserved hand of the cause of God status for his race. So at his death, Mr. Gregory's life was quickly assessed and he became a hand of the cause of God. This is an appellation as Baha'is we know not only applies to the world that we're in now, all the other worlds of God. All these people who are appointed hands, they're hands of the cause of God right now. Here's Mr. Gregory right here in the picture. And I just came back from Baha'i pilgrimage in 2018. And when I went to the Mountain of God, which is where the Universal House of Justice and the Baha'i World's Order Center is and the government is, we went to a place that housed all of the information that the Public Affairs Office shares with the world. Whose picture is on the wall? Charleston boy from this house spiritual giant, Louis Gregory. And he keeps telling us we can do the same. When Mr. Gregory would teach people, he would come to people, and they would be so moved by his spirit, and he never let it get to his hand. You know what he told them? If you get involved with this work too, the same thing will happen to you. That's all he would say. Because he knew if you're obedient to God, your light's going to shine. Let your light so shine before men, so they can see your good work and glorify your Father which is in heaven. That's all he's doing. Louis Gregory. Last but not least, I'll share this briefly with you. This is the most sacred spot in the Baha'i world. This is the place of interment of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. Shoghi Effendi's wife, Amata Mahal Rahia Khanum, when this building was being dedicated in 2003, she was still alive. There were some Baha'is on pilgrimage, and so she rolled up and gave them this picture. And she said, I want this to be placed in Mr. Gregory's museum. They brought it, so there it is displayed.
So where is it?
Huh?
Where is that place?
That is in Baji, Haifa, Israel, right across the bay from Haifa.
I've been to Haifa.
Huh?
Haifa, but they don't open the main temple or whatever, white building
Yeah.
to public. Only the
Yeah,
gardens
that's right.
were shown.
Yeah, only the Baha'is can go in everything.
Right, and only the gardens were, which
Yes.
are very beautiful.
Beautiful gardens, yes.
Water dribbling from top to
Yes.
bottom, very lovely.
Yes, and
So
This-
if that is the place.
this
that
is,
white
okay,
building.
remember this. When you look at the Mountain of God, the place that you're talking about that has a shrine of the Bahad and with the terraces, the 18 terraces, across the bay, if you look across the bay,
Oh.
that's where this is, over on that side. Yes. And so that concludes this tour of the museum. But there are quite a few books, if you want to read some things on Mr. Gregory, that,
I like this also.
yeah, okay.
Like gold.
That's one thing I'll share with you about his
Like
life.
pure gold, they say.
Mr. Abdul Bahad, in speaking about Mr. Gregory, he would talk about him quite often to the Baha'is. He says, he's like pure gold.
Oh, that's how it came from.
And even when he talked to, when he arranged their marriage, if you read in his biography, which is done by Gail Morrison, Abdul Bahad even talked to Mr. Gregory's wife, and he told her, he says, you should be thankful to God for him giving you such a wonderful man as a husband.
Yeah. I know you get emotional because
Yeah.
you have love for Madhullah and Gregory both,
Yeah.
which is so nice to see nowadays. Yeah.
So I'm going to open up to questions for anyone, including us. If anyone has any questions, we have Dee Shanti and Mr. Al Neesmith here to help us and guide us, help us understand the Baha'i faith more, and also help us understand the life of Louis G. Gregory as well. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the notes area, the question area, and I would be happy to ask them. I have a few, and I know Shayla probably does as well. I might start if that's okay. I just wanted to ask about, we talked about the structure, sort of the assembly and the structure of the Baha'i faith. I wonder about, is there a spiritual leader within every community? Is there one person or individual who might lead the community in prayer? Or is it more of a meeting, I wondered?
In the Baha'i faith, we do not have ministers. In this dispensation, God has given each individual the capacity to understand His Word themselves. That's why I was sharing with you earlier, when we read the Baha'i writings, your level of understanding is all predicated on you. And when the Baha'is read, I can be reading something, and Dee would say, after reading it, I get this from that. And I accept that. And I might read it and I might get something totally different. sometimes you might ask each other, so how do you get that? And you two kinds of, because that is what it is. Each person, when they are created, they have a capacity that's predetermined. Some people, it's a thimble full. Some people, it's a cup full. Some people, it's half a cup. But our journey in this life, when we come from our mom, from that world of God to this world of God, our job is to actualize that capacity that was put in us at birth. And that's what we keep continuously doing. And yes, there will be pitfalls. The pitfalls, as we understand as Baha'is, the spiritual tests, we call them tests and difficulties. When they happen, we shouldn't be sad about them. We shouldn't be happy. We shouldn't be in the middle way, because that's the way your spiritual side gets developed, preparing you for the next world. If you don't have tests, you can't develop your spiritual side.
Speaking to the whether or not we have clergy, Baha'u'llah and Abdul Bahad felt very strongly about how the faith should be structured to avoid fracture. So in the writings they talk about when Baha'u'llah passed, he named Abdul Bahad. When Abdul Bahad passed, he named Shoghi Effendi. And then after Shoghi Effendi, and correct me if I'm wrong, it went to a universal house of justice. So that was all laid out by Baha'u'llah in his writings in the 1800s. He saw this progression and knew where it needed to go. So there is a universal house of justice, which is stationed in Haifa. And those 9 souls are elected by the Baha'is all over the world in a tiered system. So it's all spiritually led. So in this community, the local spiritual assembly that I am blessed to be a part of, we are elected, our 9 members are elected by the Charleston community. We vote for the leaders in the region that we belong in. The region votes for the leaders in the country, does it go region or country? National. So we have a national spiritual assembly that is another 9 souls. And there's no elections, there's no campaigning. It's all by very personal ballot between you and your God. And so the souls that are elected to the National Spiritual Assembly serve on that. And then the National Spiritual Assemblies from all over the world vote for the Universal House of Justice, right? It goes there.
Every 5 years.
Every 5 years.
I see.
So there are always 9 people. 9 is a very sacred number in the faith, and so there's always 9 people that serve on the spiritual assembly. And there is no hierarchy within those 9 people. We do have officers that we elect, but for the most part, we do everything through the means of consultation. And all of this was laid out by Baha'u'llah. So it is intentional to ensure that egos get left at the door, even though we're still human and we still sometimes bring that in. There are very specific, we call it guidance, writings from Baha'u'llah and Abdul Bahad that speak specifically how to manage egos and how to manage, the structural consultation is very specific. So certainly always encourage folks to bring every thought or personal, what's the word? We're all supposed to share our beliefs and our feelings and our thoughts about whatever it is we're consulting on. And as Al mentioned, the idea of consultation is that everyone brings what they can to the table, and through love and unity and harmony, the answer will rise to the top. So we make all decisions that way.
And the other thing with the administrative order is it is clearly stated that in the eyes of God, sex, no difference. And when you get to the spiritual world, there's no reference to sex. It's spirituality. It's luminosity of heart. And as it relates to color, Baha'i faith says that in the world of God, or even in creation, color has no importance except for adornment or for charm. And we've turned it into this. And so that's why this revelation has come, because in the Bhagavad Gita it says that I come into the world for the people that are good. When righteousness waxes wane and unrighteousness boast, that's when I come into the world. And in 1844, the Bob came into the world because that was happening in the world. And he came to tell the world that one greater than him was coming. His name was Baha'u'llah.
Mm-hmm.
I will appreciate Luis because coming from South, coming from slavery that he knew, to come up and there was the Christianity, which was that time was so much popular or imposed or whatever you call it. He could get out and see the future in Baha'i and then adhere to it for not getting the power and everything, that charm that he would have got it. But he just devoted himself. That's amazing for me. And that is your calling. 1951 he passed away, right?
Yes, 1951. Yes.
That time, discrimination was very, very rampant.
Yeah.
Rampant,
Oh, yeah.
even in South. It's still there. But what I'm saying is, Baha'i has that universal application. And it is on love and respect for each other. No discrimination between anyone. So.
And it's modeled. So in 1912, when Abdul Bahad traveled here to the United States, he traveled all around the country and gave talks in different parts of the parts of the country. And they gave a dinner for him in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Gregory was there with him. And Mr. Gregory delivered Abdul Bahad to the banquet hall, and he left. At the time, it was 1912. It was not expected that he would be allowed to attend as a guest, and he had made other arrangements. I think he had a speech he was supposed to give at Howard. And so Abdul Bahad comes into the banquet hall, and there's a large table set up with, everybody's assigned seats. And Abdul Bahad, starts to look around looking for Mr. Gregory, and he can't find him. And he says to the banquet leaders, all of the people are there, probably 200 people sitting down to eat. And he says to the banquet leaders, we will not begin until Mr. Gregory is sitting by my side. And so they waited. And somebody said, I gotta go get Mr. Gregory. So they jumped in whatever vehicle they might have at the time and went to go find him. And they waited. And the dinner did not start at the time it was supposed to, because Abdul Bahad was, and not insistent or ugly or any of that. He just said, we will not begin until he's here. And so when Mr. Gregory arrived at the banquet hall, Abdul Bahad totally blew up the seating chart and said, I want him next to me. And Mr. Gregory came and sat next to him, and then the dinner began. And so it wasn't, it was through modeling, and that's one of the things that drew me to the faith. I've been Baha'i 3 years, grew up in the Episcopal faith, and that's one of the things that drew me in was that these tenets are modeled more so than spoken or taught. They're taught, but they're taught through modeling. They're taught through example. Not proselytizing, not standing on a street corner and barking orders at people about how they need to love Baha'u'llah. It's through the movement. It's through how a person moves through the world, and that really appealed to me when I first learned about the faith. So I just wanted to share that story. That story means a lot to me.
And one of the other things so beautiful about the faith that I love is Baha'u'llah shares with us him as being the divine physician. And he says that I've already assessed this world. And if you look at each of the tenets of the Baha'i faith, they are the corrective pills that as humanity we need to take to correct. One that was so important to me was the equality of men and women. And one of the things that Baha'u'llah said to us in the writings, and this just blew me away, Men and women are complementary pairs. He said that women are superior to men as it relates to intuitive senses. That's a gift from God. So he says that man, I as a man or any man in this world cannot self-actualize, cannot become who they really are until they emancipate and make women their equal. Because it's yin and yang. You can't have yin by itself. You gotta have yin and yang. There is a chemistry that happens. The society needs to embrace the feminine spirit because it's a godly spirit. And men have to champion that. And I champion it. I have 2 daughters, and I advocate for them to do whatever they can. And Baha'u'llah tells us if women are backwards in anything, it's not because of them. It's because you haven't given them the opportunity to practice those skills. And once you give them that, they'll do it.
Yeah, even in the 1800s when Baha'u'llah was downloading his writings, he talks about if a family has 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they only have money to send one child to school, they send the girl. Because she is the one that's going to be, bringing the teachings to children and next generations. There are tenets in the faith that talk about, when we talk about all the races being one, there are also tenets in the faith that talk about special, so in the case of an election, for example, for the local spiritual assembly, if there's a tie, if 2 members of the Baha'i faith get the same number of votes, and one of them belongs to a minority, so if it was, say, myself and a black person were tied in how many votes, the position would be given to the minority. And so there are tenets in the faith going back to way before anyone was talking about these kinds of allowances to not only acknowledge the inequality that exists in our society, but to make it right. And that also really appealed to me when I was first learning the faith.
Right. Your local, shall I go ahead and ask questions?
Please.
Your local, the 9 people that you choose,
Yeah.
are they depending on sort of popularity, their knowledge of it, or their spiritual maturity that he is talking about?
It is. So each of us, as we vote, we are invited to be in prayer and be in contemplation, and we cast our votes for the 9 people, because there are 9 positions on the assembly. Each of us as Baha'is vote for 9 members of our community. It's completely secret. It's between myself and my God who my vote is.
So in name of God you vote?
Yes.
Not
And so there are no campaigns. There's no, well, I think he would be better at this job, so let's put him in. It's none of that. It's all driven by spirit. And we're humans, so maybe some people, I don't know, but the way the vote is structured, it's intentionally structured to focus on the individual Baha'i making their individual votes with only consultation with their God before they make those votes. So, and that is for every tier, for the local, for the regional, for the national, and then for the universal.
Right.
So, when the 9 souls that get voted to be the Universal House of Justice members, they don't know they're going to be invited to do that until they get notified that they have been selected. And you rarely hear of a Baha'i saying, I don't want to serve, because, basically God's tapping you on the shoulder and saying, it's your turn. And so people graciously serve regardless of, unless there's something that really precludes them from doing it, but it would have to be something pretty big. So.
That makes sense.
Do you have any administrative work that you do?
Yes.
You note down.
Yes.
And another question I had was, you were talking about Baha'u'llah. He wrote whatever he is, because most of the leaders, like Jesus Christ or Muhammad, they never wrote it. They are the disciple who wrote.
Right.
So I was wondering whether he really wrote.
Yes, so Baha'u'llah wrote most of his, if not all of it, well, not all of his writings, but most of his writings, he wrote them in captivity in prison. He was imprisoned for, Abdul Bahad grew up in prison in a what they call it, the Black Pit. It was a dungeon with no windows. Baha'u'llah had a chain around his neck and around either one or both ankles, and he, in the dark, with hundreds of other prisoners in the room with him. And that's why I said he downloaded these writings, because he was able to, scribe most of these writings. Now he had, because it was in the 1800s, he had the ability to write. There was already a system in place, whereas maybe Jesus didn't have the same kind of, most of his was through storytelling, right? His writings, if you will, weren't written down for quite some time.
No, he's
That's just the
specific.
right.
If your devotees can, if your disciple can write, you can write.
Right.
Everything is in place.
Right.
He never wrote.
Right.
That's what I was pointing
Yeah.
out.
So he did.
He wrote it himself.
So maybe being in prison, because he was in captive, and didn't know when or if he was ever going to be let out. He actually wrote them down. And then Abdul Bahad also has quite a bit of writings. The prayer that I opened with was written by Abdul Bahad.
There
That's
are
beautiful.
hundreds of Baha'u'llah wrote hundreds of volumes. I mean, every subject you could ever imagine. And they're all available and they're translated in just about every language in the world. And
How many years was he imprisoned?
what's that?
How many years was he imprisoned?
40 years.
Yeah.
40 years in prison. And the reason why they imprisoned him is because in the biblical prophecy it said that when the glory of the Father came, he would be exiled. Adrianople, Constantinople. Exactly as written in the Bible, Baha'u'llah was exiled. And when he got to Acre, is where he wrote in Adrianople all these different tablets. And they're so beautiful. They ascribed to every problem that was in the world. He would write tablets to people to get the solution. And when he got to Acre, which is across the river from Haifa, he began to write letters to all of the kings and the rulers of the world, individual letters. He wrote them twice,
Wow.
told them who he was, and told them what they needed to do. And none of them responded, except for the Queen of England. And what she said to him that if this is of God, it will last. And the only monarchy you see that's still living is that one. All the other ones were pretty much. And Napoleon received this letter and did not respond. And the United States, Ulysses Grant got a letter, and one of the letters I can recall, if I'm recalling correctly, around 1868, the letter to they call it the rulers of the republics of the Americas, and one of the lines in the letter said, "Bind up with the hand of justice the broken."
Wow. Well, I have just one last question. Thank you for that. About the community here in Charleston. Sort of your service. You talked a little bit about it, I think, before we went live, so I wanted to ask just while we're live about sort of how you have services for your community, or how many people are in the community here in Charleston, and also what COVID was like for you all, and what you anticipate it to be, the changes to be now that things are lightening up, I hope, a bit.
So currently in the Charleston Baha'i community, and that is specifically Charleston, that's not necessarily counting the folks in Mount Pleasant or the folks in North Charleston. So I know in Charleston we tend to think of Charleston as being this mass, big expanse, but specifically in Charleston, Peninsula, West Ashley, James Island, we have about 41 members here, and that fluctuates year to year because some of our members will move to other areas to help with other communities that might need assistance in certain areas. We have devotionals right now. Our consistent devotional, which is typically what our gatherings are like. It's a place where we come together, we read prayers together. The person who's hosting the devotional might put together a program of writings specific to a topic or not. And the group will read the writings and talk about what it brings up for them and how they might apply it to today. The devotionals are open to anyone in the community. You do not have to be a Baha'i. And the best way to find out about how to connect with those is on our Facebook page, Charleston Baha'i Community. There are posts on there because we send out emails every week, and you'll see posts on that Facebook page that give you the links. With COVID, we did go to Zoom devotionals, and we're still doing Zoom devotionals and meetings. The museum is not open as of yet to the general public, except on a case-by-case basis. We're working up new protocols with our vaccinations now on board. We're trying to work on being able to open the museum more commonly. Before COVID, we were meeting in the museum every Sunday for devotional, and now we do it all on Zoom at 11 a.m. Sunday morning. So go to our Facebook page, like us. You'll get notifications about the links to join us on Sunday. And again, that is not for Baha'is only. That is for anyone. There is also a pretty extensive website, Baha'i.us, where that is managed by the National Spiritual Assembly. You can learn a lot about the faith there. We also have in South Carolina, I want to say it's the second largest Baha'i community in the country. So we have the Louis Street Gregory Museum here in Charleston, and then we also have the Louis Street Gregory Baha'i Institute in Hemingway, South Carolina, which is just a little inland from Myrtle Beach. Across the street from the Institute is the Baha'i Radio, Baha'i Radio.
That's right.
And that is a 24-hour free streaming service. And so you can, on our emails that we send out for the devotionals every week, you'll see a link at the bottom there. You click on that and it'll take you straight to the website, and you can listen to the Baha'i broadcasts anytime, day or night. I believe when COVID began, we have many prayers, prayers for healing. We have a short prayer for healing and a long prayer. And when COVID first started, the Baha'i radio station started airing the long prayer for healing at 10 p.m. every evening. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but we are still in the throes of the pandemic, so it's entirely possible.
Right.
So you can catch it there. So there's a lot going on in the area and in the community that you can tap into to learn more about the faith.
Thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough for having us here.
Thank you very much for letting open your door for us.
Right.
At CIC.
Absolutely.
We are very thankful.
Again, as is our custom, we tend to close with a prayer. Al, do you have one off the top of your head that you might want to share? Or?
I want to do the prayer for America.
I can bring it up on my phone.
So we found out today that we can go to the website and also the Facebook page, Baha'i Charleston Community, to learn more. And we will link to your Facebook page this Sunday, because every Sunday we do like to highlight a faith community, ideally the one that we're just at, so people can get a sense of what a service is like or what a prayer meeting is like. So we'll do that this Sunday as well, but we'll end with a prayer here. Thank you.
This is a prayer for America. O thou kind Lord, this gathering is turning to thee. These hearts are radiant with thy love. These souls and spirits are exhilarated by the message of thy glad tidings. O God, let this American democracy become glorious in spiritual degrees, even as it has aspired to material degrees, and render this just government victorious. Confirm this reverent nation to upraise the standard of the oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become thereby most glorious
and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. O God, this American nation is worthy of thy favors and is deserving of thy mercy. Make it precious and dear and near to thee through thy bounty and bestowals. Abdul Bahad.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, thank you all for joining us. Any questions, you can go to the Facebook page or the website. And thank you again, Alni Smith and Dee Shanti and Shayla's.